The sun hung like a burning coin in the cloudless sky, its merciless rays beating down upon the parched grasslands of western Kansas. The year was 1887, and the drought had stretched on for 3 months, turning the once golden prairie into a brittle sea of yellowed stalks that crackled underfoot. Dust devils danced across the horizon, and the few scattered cottonwoods along the creek bed drooped their leaves in surrender to the heat. In the distance, a small homestead squatted against the landscape like a forgotten prayer. The wooden structure, weathered to the color of old bones, leaned slightly to the east where the prevailing winds had pushed against it for years. A broken shutter hung from one window, and the porch sagged in the middle like a tired smile. This was the home of Clara Morrison, 24 years old and 6 months a widow. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Her dress, once blue but now faded to the color of winter sky, hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight since Thomas died in the coal mine explosion that took 14 men that terrible morning in February. Her hands, roughened by lye soap and endless chores, gripped the windowsill as she watched the bird disappear beyond the ridge. The loneliness pressed against her like a physical thing. In town, the other women crossed the street when they saw her coming, whispering behind gloved hands. A young widow was dangerous, or so they believed. She might tempt their husbands, might remind them of their own mortality. Better to shun her, to let her fade into the landscape like everything else the prairie eventually claimed. Clara turned from the window and surveyed her meager domain. The larder held a sack of flour, some salt pork, dried beans, and precious little else. The well still produced water, thank the Lord, but barely enough for her and the 3 scrawny chickens that pecked listlessly in the yard. Thomas's grave lay on the small rise behind the house, marked by a wooden cross she'd fashioned herself. She visited it each evening, though she'd run out of words to say weeks ago. 20 miles north, where Willow Creek still ran with a trickle of water, stood the Triple Bar Ranch. It sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, its boundaries marked by post and wire that stretched beyond the horizon. At its heart sat a compound of buildings, barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and the main house itself, a 2-story structure built of imported limestone that gleamed white in the harsh light. Jake Thornton stood on his porch, rolling a cigarette with practiced ease. At 32, he cut an imposing figure, 6 feet 2 inches of lean muscle hardened by years of working cattle and horses. His face, weathered beyond his years, bore the permanent squint of a man who'd spent too long scanning distant horizons. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from the war between the states that he never spoke about. The ranch hands gave him a wide berth. He was known as a fair boss but a hard man, one who expected perfection and brooked no excuses. Since Margaret and little Sarah had died of scarlet fever 3 winters past, he'd become even more remote, speaking only when necessary, working from dawn to dusk as if he could outrun his grief through sheer exhaustion. "Boss," called his foreman, Samuel, from the corral. "We're heading to town for supplies. You need anything?" Jake shook his head, took a long drag from his cigarette. Town meant people, meant pitying looks and well-meaning widows trying to marry off their daughters to the wealthy rancher. He'd rather face a stampede than endure another afternoon of social niceties. Clara had no choice but to venture into Millbrook that Saturday. The flour was nearly gone, and she needed thread to mend the torn hem of her only other dress. She hitched up her old mare, Buttercup, to the rickety wagon Thomas had bought second-hand from a traveling peddler. The 15-mile journey took nearly 3 hours, the wagon wheels groaning in protest at every rut and stone. Millbrook sat at the intersection of 2 cattle trails, a collection of false-fronted buildings that proclaimed prosperity while their paint peeled in the prairie wind. The main street hosted the usual establishments: Ferguson's General Store, the Cattleman's Bank, Doc Henderson's office, and 3 saloons that did booming business when the cattle drives came through. Clara tied Buttercup to the hitching post outside Ferguson's and steeled herself for the ordeal ahead. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and conversations died like flowers in frost. Mrs. Ferguson, A pinch-faced woman who ruled the town's social hierarchy with an iron fist, looked up from her ledger with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Morrison," she said, making the title sound like an accusation. "What can I do for you?" Clara kept her chin high as she made her modest purchases. 5 pounds of flour, a small tin of baking powder, thread, and, after careful calculation, 2 pounds of sugar. It would clean her out, leave her with barely enough for the seed she'd need come spring. But she couldn't face another month of bitter coffee. She was loading her purchases into the wagon when trouble found her. 3 cowboys from the Lazy J Ranch had started their Saturday drinking early, and whiskey had made them bold. The leader, a man named Curtis with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that grabbed too freely, blocked her path. "Well, looky here," he slurred, swaying slightly. "The pretty widow woman, all alone. That ain't safe, little lady. You need a man's protection." Clara tried to step around him, but he moved with her, his friends laughing and egging him on. Fear crawled up her spine like cold fingers. The street had somehow emptied, townspeople finding urgent business elsewhere when trouble brewed. "Please let me pass," she said, hating how her voice shook. Curtis reached for her arm. "Now don't be unfriendly. We're just trying to help. The lady asked you to move." The voice came from behind Curtis, low and dangerous as a rattlesnake's warning. Jake Thornton stood in the street, his hand resting casual-like on the Colt at his hip. He'd come to town after all, driven by the need for whiskey to help him sleep. He hadn't expected to find himself in the middle of someone else's trouble, but the sight of 3 men surrounding a lone woman had acted on him like spurs to a horse. Curtis turned, recognized the rancher, and his bravado flickered. Everyone knew Jake Thornton's reputation, his deadly accuracy with a gun, his time riding with Sheridan during the war. But the whiskey made Curtis stupid. "This ain't your concern, Thornton. We're just having a friendly chat with the widow." Jake's eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, never left Curtis's face. "Seems to me the lady's made it clear she's not interested in conversation. You boys best move along." For a moment, the street held its breath. Then Curtis's friends grabbed his arms, mumbling apologies, dragging him toward the saloon. He went, but not without shooting Clara a look that promised this wasn't over. Clara found herself looking up at her unexpected defender. She'd seen Jake Thornton at a distance. Everyone knew who owned the Triple Bar, but had never been this close. The scar on his face should have made him frightening, but there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness that matched her own. "Thank you," she managed. He touched the brim of his hat, already turning away. "You shouldn't come to town alone, ma'am. It's not safe." The dismissal in his tone sparked her pride. "I have little choice, Mr. Thornton. Unlike some, I cannot afford to hire others to do my errands." He paused, looked back at her with those storm cloud eyes. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at being challenged. Then his expression hardened again. "That's not my problem, ma'am." He strode away, leaving Clara standing in the dusty street with her salvaged dignity and purchased goods. She climbed into her wagon with as much grace as she could muster, aware of eyes watching from behind curtained windows. The story would be all over town within the hour, the widow Morrison needing rescue from the mysterious Jake Thornton. As she drove home, Clara's emotions warred within her chest. Gratitude for his intervention mixed with resentment at his cold dismissal. He'd looked at her the way everyone did, as a problem, a complication, something to be dealt with and forgotten. She'd thought, for just a moment when their eyes met, that she'd seen recognition there, one wounded soul acknowledging another. But she must have been mistaken. The sun was beginning its descent when she reached home, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd had the heart to appreciate it. She unhitched Buttercup, fed the chickens, and put away her precious supplies. Then, as was her custom, she climbed the rise to Thomas's grave. "I went to town today," she told the wooden cross. "A man helped me, but I don't think he wanted to. I don't think anyone wants to help anymore. I'm so tired." Thomas, so very tired. Miles away, Jake Thornton sat on his porch with a bottle of whiskey, trying to forget the fear in a pair of blue eyes and the way a woman's voice had sparked with pride despite her circumstances. He'd learned long ago that caring about others only led to pain. Margaret had taught him that when she died, taking their daughter with her, leaving him hollow as a burned-out tree. Yet something about the widow Morrison lingered in his mind like smoke from a distant fire. Perhaps it was the way she'd stood up to him, small and fierce as a bantam hen. Perhaps it was simply that she was another soul marked by loss in this unforgiving land. He took another drink and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, each one cold and distant as the life he'd chosen for himself. Tomorrow he would ride the range, check the cattle, mend fences. He would not think about blue eyes or the way a woman's pride could shine through fear like light through cracked glass. But the prairie wind, carrying the scent of dust and dying grass, seemed to whisper otherwise. 3 days passed before Clara found the handkerchief. She'd been feeding the chickens when something white caught her eye. Snagged on the fence post near the road, the linen was fine quality, monogrammed with the initials J.T. in elegant script. She knew immediately who it belonged to. Such expensive things didn't find their way to her corner of the prairie by accident. She held the square of fabric, studying the precise stitching. Margaret Thornton's work. Most likely, the whole county knew the story of the rancher's wife, renowned for her needlework and genteel manners, carried off by fever along with their daughter. Clara folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it on the shelf beside her few dishes. She'd return it if the opportunity arose, though she doubted Jake Thornton would miss one handkerchief among what must be dozens. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next afternoon, as Clara struggled to repair a section of chicken coop that had collapsed in the night, she heard the drumming of hoofbeats. Jake Thornton rode into her yard on a black stallion that probably cost more than her entire homestead. He dismounted with easy grace, his eyes taking in the dilapidated state of her property in one sweeping glance. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim, "I believe I dropped something in town the other day." Clara straightened, acutely aware of her patched dress and the dirt under her fingernails. "Your handkerchief. Yes, I found it. Just a moment." She went inside, returning with the carefully folded linen. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed briefly, and she jerked back as if burned. He noticed, she could tell by the slight narrowing of his eyes, but said nothing. "Thank you," he said, tucking the handkerchief into his vest pocket. His gaze moved to the broken chicken coop, where boards lay scattered and wire mesh gaped open. "Having some trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle," Clara said quickly, though her bleeding fingers suggested otherwise. The wire was sharp, and she'd already torn her skin in several places trying to wrestle it back into position. Jake studied her for a long moment, then moved toward the coop without asking permission. "You're setting it wrong," he said. "The wire needs to overlap here, or the coyotes will have your birds within a week." "I know how to build a chicken coop," Clara snapped, frustration and embarrassment making her sharp. "I've managed well enough on my own." "Have you?" He gestured at the sagging structure, the broken gate, the fence posts that listed drunkenly. "Looks to me like you're barely holding on." The truth of it hit her like a slap. She was barely holding on, fighting a losing battle against the prairie and poverty and loneliness. But she'd die before admitting it to this cold-eyed stranger who looked at her with such detached assessment. "My circumstances are none of your concern. Mr. Thornton, I didn't ask for your help." "No," he agreed, still examining the coop. "But I'm offering it anyway. Stand aside." The command in his voice sparked her temper. "I don't take charity. It's not charity. It's neighborly assistance." He was already pulling off his jacket, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms corded with muscle. "Unless you'd prefer to lose your chickens to predators out of pride." Clara wanted to order him off her property, but the practical part of her mind noted that she had exactly 3 chickens left, and eggs were the only thing standing between her and complete destitution. She stepped back, arms crossed, watching as he efficiently began to repair the damage. His hands were sure and competent, making quick work of what had taken her hours to fail at. But as he reached for a high section of wire, stretching up to secure it to the post, Clara impulsively moved to help, grabbing the loose end to hold it in place. "I said stand aside," he growled, turning sharply. His hand closed over her wrist to move her back, and the sudden contact after months of isolation shot through Clara like lightning. She gasped, jerking away violently, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "You're hurting me," she said, her voice cracking with more than physical pain. Jake released her instantly, stepping back as if she'd slapped him. His face, usually carved from stone, showed a flicker of something, shock, perhaps, or shame. Clara cradled her wrist against her chest, though he hadn't gripped hard enough to actually hurt. It was the surprise of human touch, the unexpected warmth of his calloused palm, that had undone her. "I didn't mean," he began, then stopped. His gray eyes searched her face, seeing perhaps more than she wanted to reveal. The tears that had sprung to her eyes weren't from pain, but from the sudden, overwhelming reminder of what it felt like to be touched with purpose, even in anger. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and she sensed he was apologizing for more than just grabbing her wrist. Clara turned away, unable to bear the unexpected gentleness in his voice. "Perhaps you should go." But he didn't go. Instead, he returned to the chicken coop, working now in silence. Clara retreated to the porch, sinking onto the rickety steps, watching him despite herself. The late afternoon sun caught in his dark hair, revealing threads of premature silver. His movements were economical, practiced, speaking of a man who'd built many things with his own hands despite his wealth. When he finished, the coop stood straight and solid, the wire secured and taut. He collected his jacket and came to stand at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Why did you really come?" Clara asked suddenly. "A man like you doesn't ride 20 miles for a handkerchief." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I wanted to see if you were all right, after the other day in town." "Why would you care?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to surprise him. He settled his hat on his head, preparing to leave. "Curtis and his friends won't bother you again. I've made sure of it. I don't need—" "Yes," he interrupted, his voice hard again. "You do. Whether you admit it or not, you need protection. This land devours the weak. Mrs. Morrison, and a woman alone." He didn't finish, but his meaning was clear. Clara stood, anger giving her courage. "I've survived 6 months without a man's protection. I'll survive 6 more, and 6 after that if need be." "Surviving isn't living," he said quietly, mounting his horse with fluid grace. "There's a difference, though I'd forgotten it myself until recently." He turned the stallion toward the road, then paused, looking back. "That coop will hold now, but your barn roof won't last another storm. The south corner's rotted through." Then he was gone, spurring his horse into a canter that raised a cloud of dust in the evening air. Clara stood on the porch, watching until he disappeared over the rise, her wrist still tingling where he'd touched her. Inside the house, she examined her wrist in the lamplight. There was no mark, no bruise, nothing to explain the way her pulse still raced. She'd flinched from him not from fear, but from something far more dangerous, the awakening of feelings she'd thought buried with Thomas. No, that wasn't true. What she'd felt when Jake Thornton touched her was nothing like the comfortable affection she'd shared with her husband. This was something wilder, more unsettling, like the prairie fire she'd once seen racing across the grasslands, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The town, of course, had opinions. Clara heard them whispered when she ventured in for supplies the following week. Jake Thornton had been seen at the widow Morrison's place. He'd stayed for over an hour. He'd been working on her property with his own hands, like a common laborer. "Mark my words, Mrs." Ferguson pronounced to her circle of cronies, loud enough for Clara to hear. She set her cap for him, probably threw herself at him the very day he saved her from those ruffians. These young widows have no shame. Clara kept her head high, completed her purchases, and left without acknowledging the gossip. But the words stung, especially because part of her wondered if they held a grain of truth. Had she unconsciously been hoping he'd return? Had her resistance to his help been merely a ploy to keep him there longer? That night, she lay in her narrow bed listening to coyotes howl in the distance. The chicken coop stood strong, and she'd noticed Jake had been right about the barn roof. Come the first real storm, she'd likely lose it entirely. The weight of her situation pressed down like a physical thing. Winter was coming, and she had perhaps 2 months' worth of supplies if she stretched them thin. She thought of Jake Thornton's words. Surviving isn't living. Easy for him to say, with his fine ranch and full larder and cowhands to do his bidding. Yet she'd seen the emptiness in his eyes, recognized a kindred spirit walking through the motions of life without really feeling it. Perhaps wealth was just another kind of prison, 20 miles away. Jake sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. He couldn't concentrate on the ledgers before him, couldn't stop thinking about the way Clara Morrison had flinched from his touch, the tears that had sprung to her eyes. "You're hurting me," she'd said, and though he knew he hadn't gripped hard enough to cause pain, the words echoed in his mind. Margaret had never flinched from him. She'd been gentle as spring rain, soft-spoken and accommodating. She'd made their house a home, filled it with laughter and the scent of fresh bread. When she died, he'd shut down that part of himself that could feel such loss again. Better J to be stone than to risk such pain. But Clara Morrison wasn't gentle. She was proud and prickly as a cactus, fighting the world with her chin raised and her blue eyes blazing. She was magnificent in her stubborn refusal to bend, even as the prairie tried to break her, and that frightened him more than any stampede or gunfight ever had. He drained the whiskey in one burning swallow and rose to check the windows. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, purple-black and ominous. There'd be rain by morning, possibly hail. He thought of her rotted barn roof, imagined her trying to save what little hay she had stored there, and cursed under his breath. Not his problem, he reminded himself. He'd done more than enough by fixing her chicken coop. Any further involvement would only encourage the gossips and give the widow false hopes. He needed to stay away, needed to rebuild the walls she'd somehow begun to crack without even trying. But as the first drops of rain began to fall, he found himself calling for his foreman anyway. There were spare shingles in the storage shed, left over from last year's repairs. No sense in letting them go to waste. It would be neighborly to send a couple of hands over to fix the widow's roof. Just neighborly. Nothing more. The lie sat bitter on his tongue as thunder rolled across the prairie. And somewhere in the darkness, a woman alone faced another storm. The wind struck first, howling across the prairie like a living thing. Clara pressed her face against the window, watching the sky turn an ominous yellow-green. She'd seen that color before. It meant more than just a storm. Out on the horizon, a brown wall was building, rolling toward her homestead with terrifying speed. Dust storm. The kind that buried entire farms, that turned day to night and filled lungs with dirt until breathing became impossible. She flew into action, driving her 3 chickens into the coop Jake had repaired. Grateful now for his solid work. The barn. She couldn't save the barn with its rotted roof, but she could try to protect what little she had stored there. She was dragging sacks of feed toward the house when she heard the thunder of hooves. Jake Thornton materialized out of the growing darkness, his black stallion fighting the wind. Behind him, barely visible through the dust, she could make out his cattle, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, being driven by riders who appeared and disappeared in the brown haze. "Get inside!" he shouted over the wind, dismounting in one fluid motion. "My supplies! The barn! Leave them!" He grabbed her arm, and this time she didn't flinch from his touch. The urgency in his face brooked no argument. "This storm will kill you. Get inside, now!" But Clara twisted away, running back toward the barn. "I'll starve without those supplies." Jake cursed and followed her. Together they managed to drag 2 sacks of grain and her meager tools into the house just as the full force of the storm hit. The wind slammed into the structure like a giant fist, and Clara heard wood creaking ominously overhead. "The roof won't hold," Jake said, echoing her thoughts. He was already moving, pushing her table against the wall, creating a shelter. "Get under there if it starts to go." Outside, the world disappeared. The windows went black as night descended in the middle of the afternoon. Dust seeped through every crack and crevice, filling the air until Clara tied her apron over her nose and mouth. She lit a lamp, but its light barely penetrated the gloom. "Your cattle," she said, voice muffled by the cloth. "You'll lose them in this. My men know what to do. They'll drive them to Willow Creek Ravine. The walls will shelter them." He'd fashioned his own mask from his bandana, but she could see the worry in his eyes. A storm like this could devastate even a wealthy rancher's operation. The wind rose to a shriek. Something crashed against the side of the house, a piece of her barn roof, most likely. Clara found herself pressed against the wall, and suddenly Jake was beside her, his solid presence strangely comforting as the storm tried to tear her home apart. "Why were you out in this?" she asked. "You had to have seen it coming. I was checking the north pasture, saw the storm building and knew it would hit your place first." He paused, and she sensed rather than saw his shrug in the lamplight. "Figured you might need help." The admission hung between them as the storm raged. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time lost meaning in the darkness and noise. At one point, part of the roof lifted with a terrible screaming of nails and wood, and Jake pushed Clara under the table, covering her body with his as debris rained down. She felt the solid weight of him, the warmth even through the layers of dust and clothing, and something deep inside her stirred to life. When he pulled back, satisfied the immediate danger had passed, she caught his arm. "Thank you." In the dim lamplight, his dust-covered face was very close to hers. "We're not through this yet," he said roughly, but his hand covered hers briefly before he moved away. The storm raged until well past nightfall, when the wind finally began to die. They emerged from their shelter like survivors of a battle. Clara's home was still standing, though barely. Half the roof was gone, and dust covered everything inches deep. She looked at the devastation and felt tears threaten. "It's just things," Jake said quietly. "You're alive. That's what matters." "Things that meant survival," Clara replied bitterly. "Without that roof, the rest of my supplies will be ruined by the next rain. I might as well pack up now and—" She trailed off. And what? Where would she go? She had no family, no money, nothing but this failing homestead. "You could—" Jake began, then stopped. She watched him struggle with something, his jaw working. "Finally," he said. "I'll send men to fix your roof. Tomorrow." "I can't pay for—" "I'm not asking you to pay." His voice was harsh. "Call it neighborly help. Call it whatever you want. But I won't have your death on my conscience because you're too proud to accept assistance." They stood facing each other in the ruined room, dust motes dancing in the lamplight between them. Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to cling to her pride, the only thing she had left, but the reality of her situation was stark as the destroyed roof above their heads. "All right," she whispered. Something shifted in Jake's face, a softening around his eyes. "All right," he echoed. "Now, you can't stay here tonight, not with the roof gone. I'll manage. I've slept in worse. Woman, do you argue about everything?" But there was a note in his voice that might have been amusement. "I've got a dozen empty rooms at the ranch. You'll stay there tonight, and we'll sort this out tomorrow." The propriety of it made Clara hesitate. A widow spending the night at a bachelor's ranch, the gossips would have a field day. But another look at her destroyed home decided her. Survival trumped reputation. "Just for tonight," she agreed. Jake nodded and went to check on his horse. The stallion had weathered the storm tied to the sturdiest post of her porch, head down, covered in dust but unharmed. As Jake saddled him, Clara gathered a few necessities, a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, The photograph of Thomas she kept by her bed. "Leave the chickens," Jake said when she moved toward the coop. "They'll be fine until morning, and the coop you built will hold." "The coop you built," she corrected, and was rewarded with what might have been the ghost of a smile. He mounted first, then reached down to pull her up behind him. Clara hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his, letting him lift her easily onto the horse. She had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist, to press close against his back as they rode through the storm's aftermath. The prairie was transformed. Familiar landmarks were buried under feet of dust. Here and there, fence posts stuck up like grave markers. They passed dead cattle, an overturned wagon, destruction on the scale Clara had never seen. Her own losses suddenly seemed smaller in comparison. The Triple Bar Ranch, when they finally reached it, was like an oasis. The buildings had weathered the storm far better than her small homestead, though she could see damage here too, missing shingles, a collapsed section of fence, dust piled against the walls. Ranch hands were already at work with shovels and lanterns, clearing paths and checking on livestock. "Boss," a man Clara recognized as the foreman. Samuel jogged over. "We lost maybe 50 head. Drove the rest to shelter like you said. The boys are doing a count now." "Good. See to it." Jake dismounted, then helped Clara down, his hands lingering on her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "Samuel, this is Mrs. Morrison. The storm took her roof. She'll be staying tonight." If Samuel found anything unusual in this arrangement, his weathered face didn't show it. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat, "I'll have Maria prepare a room." The house, when they entered, took Clara's breath away. After months in her 2-room homestead, the spaciousness seemed almost oppressive. Fine furniture, now dusty but still elegant, filled the rooms. Paintings hung on the walls, real paintings, not just calendar prints. And everywhere, the ghost of a woman's touch, lace curtains, embroidered pillows, small decorative touches that spoke of Margaret Thornton's presence. A Mexican woman appeared, clucking in sympathy at Clara's dusty state. "Ay, pobrecita, come. I run you a bath. Get you clean clothes. I couldn't—" "You could and you will," Jake interrupted. "Maria, use the blue room, and see if any of—" He paused, swallowed. "See if there are any dresses that might fit Mrs. Morrison." Clara understood. Margaret's clothes. She wanted to protest, but the thought of a real bath, of clean clothes that weren't patched and mended, overrode her scruples. An hour later, she emerged transformed. The dress was simple but well made, a deep blue that brought out her eyes. It fit reasonably well, though Margaret had clearly been taller. Maria had helped her wash the dust from her hair, and it hung in damp waves down her back. She found Jake in his study, standing before a window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He'd cleaned up too, changed into fresh clothes. When he turned at her entrance, something flared in his eyes before he shuttered it away. "Better?" he asked. "Much. Thank you." She moved into the room, drawn by the books lining the walls. "You read. When I can't sleep." He gestured to a chair. "Which is often? Whiskey?" "I don't. Yes, actually." He poured her a small measure, and they sat in companionable silence. The storm had created an intimacy between them. Shared danger breaking down barriers faster than weeks of ordinary interaction might have. "Tell me about Thomas," Jake said suddenly. Clara looked at him in surprise. People never asked about Thomas. They offered condolences, made sympathetic noises, but no one wanted to actually hear about the man she'd lost. "He was kind," she said slowly. "Not exciting or particularly ambitious, but kind. He made me laugh. He was terrible at farming, but kept trying because he thought it would make a good life for us." She sipped the whiskey. "Let it burn." He died before he could see how badly he'd failed. "He didn't fail. You're still here. Barely. Still counts." Jake stared into his glass. "Margaret would have liked you. She had backbone too, under all the gentle manners. Stood up to me when I was being a fool." which was often. It was Clara's turn to listen as he talked, haltingly at first, about his wife, about their daughter, Sarah, who'd had his gray eyes and Margaret's smile, about the fever that had taken them both in the space of 3 days, leaving him alive and wishing he weren't. I shut down after, he admitted. Easier than feeling. Built walls so high nothing could touch me. Then you showed up in town, spitting defiance at those cowboys. Too proud to admit you were scared. And I thought... He trailed off, shook his head. Doesn't matter what I thought. But Clara thought she knew. He'd seen himself in her. Loss and stubborn survival and the terrible loneliness of going through the motions of living. The recognition had probably disturbed him as much as it had her. I should check on my men, he said abruptly. Standing. Jake. His name on her lips stopped him at the door. What you said that day, about surviving not being the same as living? You were right. He looked back at her, and for a moment his careful mask slipped. She saw hunger there, and hope, and fear all mixed together. Then he nodded once and was gone, leaving her alone with the whiskey and the books, and the growing certainty that her life had just become infinitely more complicated. Outside, the dust was settling, revealing a landscape forever changed by the storm's passage. Come morning, they would deal with damaged roofs and lost cattle and the harsh realities of prairie life. But tonight, in this lamplit room that held the ghost of another woman's happiness, Clara allowed herself to feel something she'd thought buried with Thomas, the faint stirring of possibility. Fragile as new growth after a killing frost. Dawn broke blood red over the prairie, painting the dust-covered landscape in shades of rust and crimson. Clara woke in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by the luxury of clean sheets and a room that didn't leak. For a moment, she allowed herself to pretend this was her life, waking in a solid house with sturdy walls and the smell of coffee already brewing somewhere below. But reality intruded with the sound of urgent voices in the yard. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now cleaned and mended by Maria's capable hands, and made her way downstairs. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake talking with his foreman, both men's faces grim. Morning, Maria said, pushing a cup of coffee into Clara's hands. You eat. Much trouble today. Clara wanted to ask what kind of trouble, but Jake entered before she could, his face drawn with fatigue and something else, anger, carefully controlled but visible in the tight line of his jaw. Rustlers hit the south pasture during the storm, he said without preamble. Took advantage of the chaos. We're missing near 200 head, and they burned the line shack to cover their tracks. Was anyone hurt? Tom Garrett was on watch. They shot him. He'll live, Doc says, but it was close. Jake accepted coffee from Maria, his movements sharp with suppressed violence. I know who did it. The Coulson gang's been working this territory, hitting ranches during storms or stampedes when the hands are scattered. Clara set down her cup carefully. I should go home. You have enough to deal with. You're not going anywhere. The command in his voice made her bristle, but he continued before she could protest. These aren't just cattle thieves. Clara, they're killers. They hit the widow Hernandez's place last month, burned her out when she couldn't pay protection money, with your roof gone and you alone. He didn't finish, but his meaning was clear. So what am I supposed to do? Hide here forever? Until I deal with Coulson, yes. He was already strapping on his gun belt, checking the loads in his Colt. Samuel's sending men to fix your roof today. Once it's done and Coulson's run off or dead, you can go home. The casual way he spoke of killing should have frightened her. Instead, Clara found herself studying the controlled violence in his movements, the way his hands, the same hands that had sheltered her during the storm, now prepared instruments of death with practiced efficiency. Be careful, she said quietly. He paused at the door, looked back. I always am. But 3 days later, he wasn't careful enough. Clara was helping Maria in the kitchen, learning to make tortillas, when riders thundered into the yard. Through the window, she saw Jake slumped in his saddle, blood soaking through his shirt. Samuel holding him upright. She flew outside, fear clawing at her throat. What happened? Ambush at Devil's Canyon. Samuel grunted, helping Jake down. Boss got 2 of them, but took a bullet in return. Help me get him inside. Jake was semi-conscious, his face gray with pain and blood loss. They half-carried him to the downstairs bedroom, Clara supporting his weight on one side while Samuel took the other. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the fever already setting in. I'll ride for Doc Henderson, Samuel said. No. Jake's voice was weak but firm. Storm took out the bridge at Miller's Crossing. Doc can't get here for days. Then You'll take the men and finish what we started. Jake interrupted. Coulson's holed up at the old Baxter place with what's left of his gang. Hit them now while they think I'm dead or dying. Samuel clearly wanted to protest, but decades of following orders won out. Yes, boss. When he'd gone, taking most of the hands with him, Clara and Maria were left to tend Jake. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone through his left shoulder, missing the lung but tearing muscle and grazing bone. Maria had some medical knowledge from tending ranch injuries, but she shook her head grimly. Need doctor. Without doctor, maybe he'd die. He won't die. Clara said it fiercely, as if her determination alone could make it true. Get me hot water, clean cloth, and whatever whiskey you can find, and needle and thread, the finest you have. For the next hours, Clara worked with a focus born of desperation. She cleaned the wound, picking out bits of cloth and debris while Jake drifted in and out of consciousness. The exit wound was worse than the entry, ragged and seeping. She packed it with whiskey-soaked cloth, remembering something Thomas had told her about a field surgeon he'd known in the war. Why? Jake muttered during one of his lucid moments, gray eyes finding hers. Why stay? Because you stayed for me, Clara answered simply, wringing out another cloth in the basin that had turned red with his blood. During the storm, you could have ridden to safety, but you stayed. He tried to smile. Wasn't the same. Hush, save your strength. The fever rose as night fell. Jake tossed restlessly, sometimes calling for Margaret, sometimes warning unseen enemies. Clara bathed his face and chest with cool water, fighting the heat that threatened to consume him. Maria brought broth, medicines from her private stores, herbs and tinctures that might help or might do nothing. You care for him, Maria observed during one quiet moment. Clara didn't deny it. When had her feelings shifted from wariness to something deeper? Perhaps during the storm, when he'd sheltered her with his own body. Perhaps in his study, sharing whiskey and grief. Or perhaps just now, seeing him vulnerable, all his walls down as he fought for life. He won't let himself care back. Clara said softly, he's too locked in his grief. Maybe, maybe no. Maria patted her shoulder. Grief is like winter, seems to last forever, but spring always comes. On the second night, Jake's fever broke in a drenching sweat. Clara was dozing in the chair beside his bed when he spoke her name, voice clear for the first time in days. You're still here. Where else would I be? She leaned forward, touching his forehead, cool at last. How do you feel? Like I've been shot. His attempt at humor made her smile despite everything. Samuel? Sent word this morning. They got Coulson and 4 of his men, the rest scattered to the wind. Your cattle are recovered, most of them anyway. Good. He tried to sit up, grimaced, and fell back. You should go home. Your roof is fixed, Samuel saw to it. She helped him sip water, supporting his head. Stop trying to get rid of me. You're in no condition to be alone. Maria has been up for 2 days straight. She's resting. Clara set the glass aside, met his eyes squarely. I'm not leaving until you're well. Accept it. Something passed across his face, frustration, resignation, and perhaps relief. You're a stubborn woman, Clara Morrison. So I've been told. They fell into a routine over the following days. Clara tended his wound, helped him eat, read to him from the books in his study when he grew restless. The intimacy of caring for him broke down barriers between them. She learned he liked poetry but pretended not to. That he'd grown up poor before making his fortune in cattle. That he blamed himself for Margaret and Sarah's deaths because he'd been away on business when the fever struck. Wouldn't have changed anything, Clara told him one evening as she changed his bandages. The wound was healing clean. No sign of infection. Fever doesn't care if you're there or not. Maybe, but they died without me. Sarah asked for Papa, and I wasn't there. The old pain was raw in his voice. I failed them. No. Clara secured the fresh bandage, then did something she'd been wanting to do for days. She took his hand in both of hers. You love them. That's not failure. The only failure would be letting their death stop you from living. He turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. Physician, heal thyself? Something like that. They stayed that way, hands linked, as shadows lengthened in the room. Neither spoke of what was happening between them, the connection growing stronger each day. But Clara felt it in the way his eyes followed her movements, in how her heart lifted when he smiled, in the reluctance with which they parted each evening. The town, of course, had opinions about Clara nursing Jake Thornton back to health. Living in his house, bold as brass. Mrs. Ferguson announced to anyone who'd listen. Playing nurse, she calls it. We all know what she's really playing at. But others were kinder. Doc Henderson, when he finally arrived to check Jake's progress, pulled Clara aside. You did good work here, better than some trained physicians I've known. He'd have died without your care. I did what anyone would. No, the doctor interrupted. You did what someone who cared would do. There's a difference. He studied her shrewdly. He's a good man under all that stone. Lost his way after Margaret died. But maybe he's finding it again. Clara wanted to hope that was true. But Jake grew more distant as he healed. The walls came back up, brick by brick. He was polite but formal, thanking her for her care with the same tone he'd use for a hired nurse. When he was finally able to move around on his own, he made it clear her presence was no longer needed. Your home is repaired, he said one morning, standing stiffly by the study window. I've had Samuel stock your larder and replace what was lost in the storm. There's no reason for you to stay longer. The dismissal stung more than any physical blow. I see, and that's what you want? For me to go? He didn't turn around. It's what's best. People are talking. Your reputation. I don't care about my reputation. You should. Now he did turn, and his face was carved from granite again. You're young. You could remarry, have children, build a life. That won't happen if you're branded as a kept woman. Is that what you think I am? It's what everyone else thinks. Clara stood, anger and hurt warring in her chest. And what do you think, Jake? Or are you too much of a coward to say? His jaw tightened. I think you should go home. Today. I'll have Samuel drive you. She left within the hour, sitting rigid beside Samuel on the wagon seat, her few belongings in back. She didn't look back at the house, didn't see Jake watching from the upstairs window, his fist pressed against the glass. Her homestead seemed smaller than ever after the spaciousness of the triple bar. But it was hers, and it was whole again. Roof repaired, walls reinforced, larder full. Jake had been generous in his repayment, too generous. She'd have to find a way to pay him back, though she suspected he'd calculated exactly how much she could afford to refuse. That night, alone in her narrow bed, Clara finally let herself cry. Not the desperate tears of grief she'd shed for Thomas, but the hot tears of frustration and loss for something that had never quite been allowed to bloom. She'd seen beneath Jake Thornton's armor, glimpsed the man he could be if he'd only let himself, but he'd chosen his walls over her, chosen the safety of isolation over the risk of feeling again. The next morning, she dried her tears, squared her shoulders, and got on with the business of survival. If Jake Thornton wanted to bury himself alive in his grief, that was his choice. She had chickens to feed, a garden to tend, a life to rebuild. But sometimes, in the evening when the sun painted the prairie gold, She found herself looking north toward the triple bar and wondering if he ever looked south toward her. Spring came late that year, creeping across the prairie in fits and starts. Clara watched the green shoots push through the earth with a mixture of hope and weariness. She'd survived the winter on Jake's provisions and her own stubborn will, but barely. The chickens had multiplied. She had 8 now, and she'd managed to trade eggs for seed at Ferguson's store, enduring misses. Ferguson's continued disapproval with stony silence. It had been 3 months since she'd left the Triple Bar Ranch. 3 months of silence. She'd heard news of Jake through the occasional gossip that reached her. He was well. The ranch prospered. He'd driven a herd to Dodge City and gotten top dollar, but he might as well have been on the moon for all the contact between them. Clara was mending harnesses in the barn when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. She reached for the shotgun Thomas had left her. Checked the load. The Colson gang was broken, but desperate men had a way of regrouping. But it wasn't outlaws who rode into her yard. It was Samuel and 2 Triple Bar hands, their face grim with urgency. "Mrs. Morrison." Samuel touched his hat. "Boss needs you." Clara's heart lurched, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Thornton made it clear he doesn't need anyone. Not the boss asking, 'Ma'am, it's me.'" Samuel's weathered face showed genuine worry. "He's been working himself into the ground since you left. Dawn to past dark, barely eating, pushing too hard. Yesterday his horse spooked at a rattler, threw him bad, hit his head on a rock. Then get Doc Henderson. Doc's with him now, but—" Samuel hesitated. "He ain't waking up proper. Keeps calling for Margaret. Sometimes for you. Doc says maybe a familiar voice might help bring him round." Clara wanted to refuse. Jake had sent her away, chosen his solitude over whatever they might have built together. But the memory of him fighting fever, vulnerable and human, overrode her pride. "Let me get my things." The ride to the Triple Bar seemed endless. Clara's mind conjured terrible scenarios. Jake dying. Jake paralyzed. Jake lost forever in the maze of his own mind. By the time they reached the ranch, her composure was hanging by a thread. Doc Henderson met them at the door. He's conscious, but confused. Concussion for certain. Maybe worse. Keeps slipping in and out, mixing past and present. The doctor's kind eyes studied Clara. "He asked for you, several times." Clara found Jake propped up in bed, his head bandaged, face pale beneath his tan. His eyes were open but unfocused, seeing something beyond the room. "Margaret," he said when she entered. "I'm sorry I was late. The storm held me up." Clara's throat tightened. She moved to the bedside, took his hand. "It's Clara. Jake, you're hurt, but you're going to be fine." His eyes sharpened momentarily, finding hers. "Clara, you came back." "Samuel asked me to—" "No." His grip tightened on her hand. "You came back. I dreamed it so many times. You standing in the doorway with the sun behind you, like an angel." His words slurred slightly. "But angels don't stay. They have wings." Doc Henderson moved quietly to her side. "The confusion's normal with head injuries. He may drift in and out for days. Someone needs to watch him, keep him calm, make sure he doesn't worsen." "I'll stay," Clara heard herself say. And so began a strange dance of time. Jake would be lucid for hours, then slip away into memories or delirium. Sometimes he was back in the war, warning soldiers about enemy positions. Sometimes he was with Margaret, planning their daughter's birthday party. And sometimes he was fully present, watching Clara with eyes that held too much. "Why did you come?" he asked during one clear moment, as she spooned broth into his mouth. "Because you needed me. I sent you away." "Yes, you did." She set the bowl aside. "That was foolish of you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Everything I've done since Margaret died has been foolish, except for fixing your chicken coop." That made sense. The days blended together. Clara fell back into the rhythm of caring for him. But this time was different. The head injury had cracked something open in Jake. some defensive wall that had kept his emotions locked away. He talked more freely, sometimes to her, sometimes to phantoms only he could see. She had yellow hair, he said one evening, staring at something beyond Clara's shoulder. Sarah, like corn silk. Margaret used to tie it up with ribbons. His eyes focused suddenly on Clara. Do you want children? The question caught her off guard. Thomas and I hoped, but it never happened. Margaret lost 2 before Sarah. Nearly killed her both times. When Sarah came healthy and whole, we thought God had finally smiled on us. His voice turned bitter. 3 years. That's all we got. 3 years before he took her back. Clara squeezed his hand. Tell me about her. About the good times. And he did. Over the following days, as his mind cleared gradually, Jake painted pictures with words of a little girl who collected feathers and sang to the horses, who insisted on wearing her Sunday dress to feed chickens. The memories seemed to heal something in him, as if speaking them aloud released their hold on his heart. Maria watched it all with knowing eyes. He different with you, she told Clara one morning. Like plant too long without water, finally getting rain. He'll send me away again when he's well, Clara said, trying to prepare herself. Maybe no. A week into her stay, Clara woke to find Jake's bed empty. Panic shot through her. Doc Henderson had warned about disorientation, the danger of him wandering off. She flew downstairs, out into the pre-dawn darkness, and found him in the barn, saddling his horse with shaking hands. What are you doing? She grabbed the saddle, trying to pull it from his grip. Have to check the north pasture. Fence is down. Cattle will scatter. His eyes were wild, unfocused. Jake, stop. You're hurt. There's no fence down. There's always something broken. His voice cracked. Always something that needs fixing. If I fix enough things, maybe she'll come back. Maybe they'll both come back. Oh, Jake. Clara's heart broke for him. She gently pried his fingers from the saddle. They're not coming back. No amount of fixing will change that. He sagged against her suddenly, all his strength gone. I know. God, I know. But what else is there? There's living, Clara said softly, supporting his weight. There's sunrise and sunset and spring rain. There's work that matters and people who care. She paused, gathered courage. There's me, if you'll let there be. He pulled back to look at her, really look at her, as if seeing her for the first time. You terrify me, he admitted. The way I feel when you're near, like something inside me is waking up after a long winter, and it hurts. Growing pains, Clara said. Life coming back always hurts a little. He lifted his hand to her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. I could love you. Clara Morrison, I think I already do. But I'm scared I'll lose you too. And I can't do that again. You can't live being scared of maybe. Clara told him, that's not living at all. That's just waiting to die. They stood there in the barn as dawn broke outside, surrounded by the quiet sounds of horses and the smell of hay. Then Jake leaned down and kissed her, soft and tentative, like a man remembering how to hope. But when he was fully recovered, the walls came back. You should go home, he said one morning, standing stiffly by the study window again. It was like reliving their parting months ago. I'm well now. There's no need. Stop. Clara's voice cut through his words like a blade. Don't you dare do this again. Don't you dare kiss me in the barn and tell me you love me and then send me away like hired help. He turned, his face a mask. What happened in the barn was the concussion talking. I wasn't myself. Liar. She stood, moved toward him. You were more yourself than you've been in years, and it scared you, so now you're running back to your walls and your grief and your safety. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You'd rather be alone and miserable than risk feeling again. You'd rather honor the dead by dying inside than honor them by living the life they can't. She was close to him now, close enough to see the war in his eyes. Well, I won't be sent away again. Jake Thornton, if you want me gone, you'll have to look me in the eye and tell me you don't love me. Tell me you felt nothing when you kissed me. Tell me you want to spend the rest of your life alone on this ranch with nothing but ghosts for company." The silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Jake's jaw worked. His hands clenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I can't." "Can't what?" "Can't tell you I don't love you. Can't send you away again. Can't—" His control broke. "Can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop wanting you here. Can't stop being terrified that if I let myself have this, it'll be taken away like everything else. Then don't send me away." Clara said simply, "Let me stay. Let us figure this out together. Let yourself have a chance at happiness again." Jake closed his eyes, and when he opened them, she saw surrender there. "You'll be the death of me, Clara Morrison." "No," she corrected, stepping into his arms. "I'll be the life of you." This time when he kissed her, there was nothing tentative about it. It was a claiming and a promise, fierce with too many months of denial. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he said, "not as my nurse or my housekeeper. Stay as mine. On one condition," Clara said, pulling back to meet his eyes. "No more walls. No more sending me away when you get scared. We face whatever comes together." "Together," he agreed, and the words sounded like a vow. Outside, the prairie stretched endless under the spring sky. There would be challenges ahead, drought and storms, gossip and judgment, but standing there in Jake's arms, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the solid certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Not just surviving, but living. Not just existing, but loving and being loved in return. The ghosts would always be there, Thomas and Margaret and little Sarah. But ghosts could coexist with the living, memory with hope, past with future. And in the warm circle of Jake's arms, with spring turning the world green again, anything seemed possible. The drought began in June, creeping across the prairie like a disease. At first, it seemed like just another dry spell. The Kansas territory had seen plenty of those. But as July burned into August with no relief, the situation grew dire. Streams dried to trickles, then to cracked mud. The grass turned brown and brittle, crumbling to dust under the hooves of increasingly desperate cattle. Clara stood beside Jake on the hill overlooking the Triple Bar's main water source, Willow Creek. What had once been a reliable flow was now barely a muddy seep. "How long can the cattle last?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. 2 weeks, maybe 3, if we're careful with rationing. Jake's face was grim beneath the shadow of his hat. "After that, we'll start losing them. Already had to put down 6 head that got stuck trying to reach the mud at the bottom of Miller's Pond." They'd been together 4 months now, Clara splitting her time between her homestead and the ranch. The arrangement had set tongues wagging, but she'd found she cared less about gossip than she'd thought. What mattered was the way Jake's face softened when he saw her each morning, the peace that had gradually replaced the haunted look in his eyes. But now the drought threatened everything they'd begun to build. "There's still water at the Morrison place," Clara said quietly. Her small spring had always run deeper than the surrounding sources, fed by some underground flow. "It's not much, but—" "No," Jake's response was immediate. "That's your water. Your security. Jake, I won't take from you. Clara, not that." But as the drought worsened, desperation drove others to less noble choices. The first sign of trouble came when Clara returned to her homestead to find her fence cut and cattle tracks leading to her spring. Someone had watered their herd at her source, leaving the area around it churned to mud. "Probably the Baxter outfit," Samuel said when Jake brought him to investigate. "They're in bad shape. Heard they already lost 50 head. "Post guards," Jake ordered. Nobody touches Clara's water without permission. The decision didn't sit well with everyone. At the next town meeting, voices rose in anger. "Thornton's hoarding water," Ben Baxter accused, standing before the assembled crowd in the church that served as their meeting hall. "Got his men guarding the Morrison Spring like it's gold while our cattle die." "It's Mrs. Morrison's water, Jake said calmly, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. She has the right to protect it. She's your woman. Baxter spat. Everyone knows it. You're using her claim to keep water from the rest of us. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Clara stood, moving to stand beside Jake. My water is my own, Mr. Baxter. And if you'd asked instead of cutting my fence like a thief in the night, we might have worked out an arrangement. Arrangement, Mrs. Ferguson's voice dripped disdain. What kind of arrangement could a widow have except the one she's already made with Mr. Thornton? The insult was clear. Clara felt Jake tense beside her, his hand moving toward his gun. She touched his arm, stilling him. The kind where I trade water access for help rebuilding my barn, Clara said steadily. Or for a share of next year's crops. The kind honest neighbors make with each other instead of sneaking around in darkness. She's right. Doc Henderson spoke up. We're facing disaster here. Fighting amongst ourselves won't bring rain. The meeting devolved into arguments. Those with water sources defending their rights. Those without demanding sharing, and underlying it all. The growing panic as the drought deepened. Finally, Mayor Hutchins called for order. We'll put it to a vote, all in favor of requiring equal sharing of all water sources. Hands rose throughout the room. Clara counted. It would be close. All opposed. More hands, but barely. The mayor counted twice before announcing, motion fails by 3 votes. Water rights remain with the landowners. The crowd erupted. Ben Baxter stormed out, followed by several others, their faces dark with anger. Clara heard muttered threats, promises that this wasn't over. You've made enemies today, Jake said quietly as they left the church. We made enemies. They're yours too now. He took her hand, squeezed it. I can handle enemies, done it before. But this was different from fighting outlaws or rustlers. This was neighbor against neighbor. Desperation driving wedges between people who'd lived peacefully side by side for years. The drought was revealing the worst in human nature, and Clara feared where it would lead. Her fears proved justified 3 nights later. She was staying at Jake's ranch when riders thundered into the yard. Samuel burst through the door. Fire at the Morrison place. Whole skies lit up. They rode hard through the darkness, but Clara knew they'd be too late. She could see the glow from miles away, orange against the star-filled sky. By the time they arrived, her barn was fully engulfed, flames leaping toward the house. The spring! Someone shouted. Use the water from the spring! But when they reached it, they found why the fire had been set. The spring had been dynamited, the rocks that channeled its flow scattered, the water seeping uselessly into the thirsty ground. It would take weeks to repair, if it could be repaired at all. Clara stared at the destruction of her lifeline, too shocked for tears. Jake's arms came around her from behind, holding her as they watched her barn collapse in a shower of sparks. Who? She whispered. Does it matter? Jake's voice was hard as granite. Baxter, probably, or someone who voted with him. Someone who figured if they couldn't have your water, nobody should. The fire spread to the house despite their efforts. Without the spring to fight it, they could only watch as Clara's home burned. Everything she'd fought to preserve, everything Thomas had built, gone in smoke and flame. You'll stay at the ranch, Jake said, and this time it wasn't a question. Clara nodded, too numb to argue. She had nowhere else to go. The next morning, surveying the smoking ruins by daylight, they found evidence the fire had been deliberately set. Coal oil splashed on the barn walls, boot prints of several men. But evidence and proof were different things, and everyone knew the sheriff was Ben Baxter's cousin. I should have posted guards, Jake said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. Should have known they'd try something. You can't guard against hate, Clara said wearily. She poked through the ashes of her house, finding little to salvage. Her mother's Bible, ironically, had survived, protected by the metal box she'd kept it in. Thomas's photograph was gone, along with everything else that had made this place home. The town was divided when news of the fire spread. Some expressed sympathy, even outrage. Others muttered that Clara had brought it on herself by refusing to share. The drought had turned neighbor against neighbor, and Clara found herself at the center of the storm. "You should leave," Mrs. Henderson said quietly when Clara went to town for supplies. The doctor's wife had always been kind, but now her face was creased with worry. "Go somewhere with water, with law. This is only going to get worse. And let them win. Better than dying, child. The Baxter faction is getting desperate. And desperate men." She didn't need to finish. Clara had seen desperation in Ben Baxter's eyes at the town meeting. The drought was killing his ranch, his future, his family's hope. When people had nothing left to lose, they became capable of anything. Jake wanted to strike back, to ride on Baxter with his men and deliver frontier justice. It took all Clara's persuasion to stop him. "That's what they want," she argued, "to turn this into a war. Then they can claim self-defense when they come for the Triple Bar's water. So we do nothing. We survive. We wait for rain. We don't give them excuse to escalate." But the next town meeting escalated things anyway. This time, Baxter came prepared with a lawyer from Dodge City, a sharp-dressed man who spoke of eminent domain and public necessity. "In times of crisis," the lawyer proclaimed, "individual rights must yield to the common good. I prepared a legal motion to commandeer all water sources for public use until the drought ends." "That's theft." Jake stood, his hand on his gun. "Plain and simple. It's the law." The lawyer smiled coldly. "Or it will be once the territorial judge reviews it, unless, of course, Mr. Thornton would prefer to settle this matter privately." The threat was clear. Pay him off or face legal battles that could drag on past the point where it mattered. Clara saw Jake's jaw clench, saw him weighing options that all led to loss. "How much?" Jake asked flatly. The lawyer named a figure that made Clara gasp. It would bankrupt even the Triple Bar. "That's robbery," someone called out. "That's business," the lawyer replied. "Mr. Thornton has a choice. Pay for exclusive water rights, or lose them entirely when my motion passes. Your motion won't pass." Doc Henderson stood. "Judge Morrison is an honest man." "Judge Morrison is in Kansas City," the lawyer said smoothly. "His replacement, Judge Carter, is more understanding of the needs of the many versus the few." Clara felt the trap closing. They'd planned this carefully. The fire to destroy her independent water source. The legal threat to Jake's. Either he paid and bankrupted himself, or he fought and lost in a court already bought and paid for. "You have a week to decide," the lawyer concluded. "After that, I file the motion." The meeting broke up in chaos. Outside, Jake pulled Clara aside. "Pack what you need. We're leaving." "Jake, no. The ranch means nothing if I lose you." His eyes were fierce. "Baxter's faction won't stop with legal threats. You saw what they did to your place. So we run? Let them win. We live. We can start over somewhere else. California, Oregon, somewhere with water and law that works." Clara looked at him, this proud man willing to give up everything he'd built to keep her safe. She loved him for it, even as she knew she couldn't let him do it. "No," she said firmly. "We stay. We fight. But we fight smart. Clara, I have an idea." She thought of the destroyed spring, water seeping uselessly into the ground. What if we didn't hoard the water? What if we shared it, but on our terms? Jake frowned. "Explain." "Your ranch has the deepest wells. My spring, even damaged, still flows some. What if we organized a cooperative? Everyone contributes what water they have. Everyone shares according to their herd size. Fair distribution, but managed properly." Baxter would never agree. Baxter's already lost 30 more cattle since the meeting. His ranch is dying. If we offer him a lifeline, saving face, he might take it. Jake stared at her. "You want to help the man who burned your home. I want to survive. We all do. The drought's the real enemy. Jake, not each other. If we keep fighting amongst ourselves, we'll all lose." It took 2 days of negotiation. Doc Henderson and Mayor Hutchins serving as intermediaries. Baxter was suspicious, his pride wounded. But the daily death of his cattle spoke louder than pride. The agreement was simple. All water sources would be mapped and measured. Each ranch would contribute access based on what they had and draw based on their needs. Jake's triple bar would manage distribution. His men had the expertise and, more importantly, the armed force to prevent cheating. "This won't make us friends," Baxter said as he signed the agreement. "Don't need friends," Jake replied. "Just neighbors who won't burn each other out." The cooperative wasn't perfect. There were disputes, accusations of unfair distribution, tense moments when violence threatened. But it held. Barely. As the drought stretched through September into October. Then, on a morning when the last of the grass had turned to dust and vultures circled constantly overhead, Clara woke to the sound of thunder. The rain, when it came, fell like redemption from the sky. Not a brief shower, but a steady, soaking downpour that lasted 3 days. Creeks ran again, springs refilled, and the prairie began its slow resurrection. Clara stood with Jake on the porch of the triple bar, watching the rain fall. Her homestead was gone, but she'd found something else, a home, a partner, a community that had been tested by drought and hatred, but had somehow survived. "It's over," Jake said, pulling her close. "The drought, yes, the rest." Clara thought of Ben Baxter, who'd nodded to her almost civilly at the last water distribution. "Maybe it's a beginning." "You saved us all," Jake said quietly. "Your idea, your insistence on cooperation instead of conflict. We saved each other. That's what people do when they're building something together." Jake turned her to face him, his eyes serious. "Marry me." Clara smiled. "Is that a question?" "It's a statement of fact. Marry me, Clara Morrison. Let's make this official. Scandalize the town properly." "Yes," she said simply, because after drought and fire, after loss and threats and the near destruction of everything they'd built, what was left was love, and love, like the rain now soaking the grateful earth, was enough to build a future on. As they kissed there on the porch, the rain washed the dust from the air, and somewhere out on the prairie, green shoots began to push through the soil, proof that life always finds a way. The rustlers came back in November, bolder and more vicious than before. No longer just the Colson gang. These were professionals. Confederate deserters and failed miners who'd turned to cattle theft as drought gave way to plenty. They hit the Martinez Ranch first, killing 2 vaqueros and making off with 100 head. Then the Double K, leaving old Carl Peterson beaten near to death. Jake read the telegram from Sheriff Watson with a face carved from stone. They're moving north, hitting the smaller ranches first, building a herd to drive to Mexico. Clara watched him from across the breakfast table, seeing the war brewing in his eyes. They'd been married 2 months now, a quiet ceremony that had surprised no one and scandalized everyone. She'd grown accustomed to the rhythms of ranch life, to being mistress of a large household. But she'd never seen Jake like this, cold and methodical as he planned violence. "How many men?" she asked. "Watson says 15, maybe 20. Led by a man named Dutch Kellner, ex-cavalry officer, trained his men like soldiers." Jake set down the telegram. "They'll hit us eventually. The triple bar has the best stock in 3 counties. So we prepare. I'm sending you to town. You'll stay with Doc Henderson until this is over." Clara set down her coffee cup carefully. "No, this isn't a discussion. Clara, these men are killers. They won't hesitate to burn ranches, to destroy homes, to threaten women." Clara's voice was steady. "I've faced all that before. I'm not running now. This is different. Baxter was desperate and stupid. These men are professional murderers. All the more reason I stay. The ranch needs every hand, every gun." She met his gaze squarely. "I can shoot. Thomas taught me, and I've practiced plenty since. I'm not leaving you to face this alone." They argued through breakfast, Jake growing more frustrated as Clara remained immovable. Finally, Samuel interrupted with news that ended the debate. Scouts report riders on the South Ridge, maybe a dozen, watching the ranch. Jake stood immediately, strapping on his guns. "They're scouting us, seeing our defenses." He turned to Clara. "It's too late to get you to town safely anyway. Stay in the house. Maria knows where the rifles are stored." But Dutch Kellner was smarter than previous rustlers. Instead of a direct assault on the fortified ranch house, he struck at their vulnerability, the line shacks where cowboys guarded distant herds. The attack came at sunset. Clara was helping Maria prepare dinner when they heard the shooting, distant pops like firecrackers, carried on the wind. Jake and most of his men were already riding, having gotten word of movement near the eastern pastures. "Trap," Clara said, understanding immediately. They drew Jake away. Through the window, she saw riders approaching from the west, 5 men, moving fast toward the ranch buildings. The skeleton crew Jake had left behind scrambled for positions, but they were outnumbered and caught off guard. "Maria, get to the root cellar," Clara ordered, grabbing the Winchester from above the fireplace. "Bar the door and don't come out until I tell you." "Senora, no, go!" Clara had never killed a man. She'd shot at targets, hunted rabbits and deer, but taking human life was different. Yet, as she watched the raiders torch the supply barn, heard the screams of horses trapped inside, something cold and practical took over. She braced the rifle on the windowsill, sighted on a man preparing to throw a torch at the main barn, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and the man spun and fell. No time to think about it. Another raider was shooting at Tom, the young hand who'd been teaching her to rope. Clara fired again, saw the man clutch his shoulder and retreat. The raiders hadn't expected resistance from the house. They pulled back, taking cover behind the burning supply barn, exchanging fire with the ranch hands. Clara moved from window to window, shooting when she had clear targets, keeping them pinned down. Then she heard it. Horses approaching from behind the house. More raiders, or Jake returning. She ran to the back windows, rifle ready, and nearly sobbed with relief when she recognized Samuel leading a group of triple bar riders. The raiders, caught between 2 forces, tried to flee. Most didn't make it far. Samuel's men, furious at the attack on their home, showed little mercy. Within minutes, it was over. 4 raiders dead, 1 captured. The supply barn was lost, but the main structure saved. Clara was sitting on the porch steps, rifle across her knees. When Jake thundered into the yard, he was off his horse before it fully stopped, crossing to her in 3 strides. "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her, checking for injuries. "No, I'm fine." She wasn't fine. Her hands were shaking, and she could still see the man she'd shot falling over and over. "The supply barn. Doesn't matter." He pulled her against him, and she felt him trembling too. "When I saw the smoke, thought they'd gotten to the house." He pulled back, cupped her face. "How many?" "5 men. I shot 2 of them. 1's dead." Something flickered in Jake's eyes. Pride, sorrow, understanding. "You did what you had to do. You saved lives today." But it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like crossing a line she could never uncross. That night, Clara dreamed of the falling man, woke gasping and sick. Jake held her, understanding without words. He'd crossed that line in the war, carried those ghosts still. The captured raider, wounded and facing the noose, proved talkative. Dutch Kellner had a camp in the Badlands, was planning to hit the triple bar in force within days. Take the whole herd, kill anyone who resisted, make an example that would cow the other ranches into submission. "How many men?" Sheriff Watson asked. He'd arrived with a posse, but his 4 deputies looked woefully inadequate against what they faced. 18. Last count. The prisoner wheezed. "Dutch says after we take Thornton's herd, we'll own this territory. Nobody will dare stand against us." Jake looked at the sheriff. "You going to wait for federal marshals?" Watson spat tobacco juice. "Take a week to get them here. You'll be burnt out by then. Then we handle it ourselves." Jake turned to Samuel. "Send riders to every ranch. Tell them what's coming. Tell them it's time to stand together or fall separately." The response was mixed. Some ranchers, remembering the drought cooperation, sent men immediately. Others, like Baxter, hesitated. The wounds of summer were still fresh. trust still fragile. Clara did something she'd never imagined. She rode to the Baxter Ranch herself, faced the man who'd burned her home. "Why should I help Thornton?" Baxter asked, not inviting her inside. "Man's got more than the rest of us combined." "Because Dutch Kellner won't stop with the triple bar." Clara said, "You think he'll be satisfied with one big score? He'll own this territory. You said so yourself. Every ranch will pay tribute or burn. Maybe we work out a deal with him. Like the Martinez family did, 2 dead vaqueros, like Carl Peterson, still can't walk right." Clara leaned forward in her saddle. "I know you hate us. Know you blame Jake for the drought hardships. But this is bigger than our feud. This is about whether we have law in this territory or whether we let killers rule." Baxter was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My Anna's getting married next month. Wouldn't do to have her wedding interrupted by raiders." He looked up at Clara. "I'll send 5 men, best shots I have. But this doesn't make us friends. Mrs. Thornton, just neighbors." Clara echoed Jake's words from the drought. "That's enough." In the end, they assembled 30 men, ranch hands, townspeople, even Doc Henderson despite his wife's protests. Not an army, but enough to make a fight of it. Jake spent 2 days planning, scouting the Badlands where Kellner was camped. "He's smart," Jake told the assembled men. "Picked a box canyon with only one way in. He'll see us coming. Have the high ground. So we don't go in." Clara said she'd been studying the maps too, remembering something Thomas had told her about mining. "We bring him out." The men turned to her, some dismissive, others curious. Jake nodded for her to continue. "The canyon has water, that's why he chose it. But there's an old mine shaft above it. Here," she pointed to the map. "Dynamite that, collapse it right, and it dams the stream. No water, they have to move. Move into our ambush." "Woman's got a point," Samuel said. Others nodded agreement. "It's dangerous," Jake said. "Someone would have to get close enough to set the charges." "I know the mining areas," Clara said. "Thomas worked them before we homesteaded. I can guide a small group." "Absolutely not. Jake," her voice cut through his protest. "You can't protect me from this. It's my plan, my risk to take." They argued privately, fiercely, but Clara wouldn't budge. Finally, Jake agreed. She would guide, but not participate in the actual assault. Samuel and 2 demolition-experienced miners would handle the explosives. The night of the attack was moonless, perfect for stealth. Clara led her small group through paths Thomas had shown her, trails deer used that men rarely knew. Below, they could see the raiders' campfires, hear their drunken singing. Kellner's men felt safe in their fortress. Setting the charges took patience and skill. One wrong move would bring the raiders down on them. Clara kept watch, rifle ready, as the men worked. Every sound seemed magnified, the scrape of boots on rock, the soft clink of tools. When a sentry passed close below, they froze, barely breathing, until he moved on. Finally, the charges were set. They retreated to safe distance, and Samuel lit the fuse. The wait seemed eternal. Then the night exploded. Rock and earth fountained skyward, and with a grinding roar, half the canyon wall collapsed into the stream. The water backed up immediately, flooding the lower areas where the raiders were camped. Shouts and gunfire erupted below as Kellner's men scrambled for higher ground. Jake's force was waiting at the canyon mouth, positioned behind rocks and ridges. As the raiders fled the rising water, they ran into a wall of lead. The battle was fierce but brief, caught between water and gunfire, disorganized and demoralized. The raiders broke. Some surrendered. Others, including Dutch Kellner, chose to go down fighting. By dawn, it was over. 11 raiders dead, 6 captured. The rest scattered to the winds. Clara found Jake among the wounded being tended by Doc Henderson. A bullet had grazed his ribs, painful but not serious. She helped bandage him as the sun painted the Badlands red. "Your plan worked perfectly," he said, wincing as she tightened the bandage. "You've got a tactical mind, Mrs. Thornton." "I had a good teacher," she said, thinking of all the nights Jake had talked strategy, had shared his war experiences. Clara. Ben Baxter approached, hat in hand. I wanted to, that is, he struggled with words. You rode to my place, asked for help after what I did. That took courage. It took necessity. Clara corrected. We needed every gun. Still. Baxter met her eyes. I was wrong. About the water. About many things. The fire at your place. I didn't order it, but I didn't stop it either. I'm sorry. Clara studied him. This proud man offering an apology that clearly cost him. We've all done things the drought drove us to. Maybe it's time to let that go. Baxter nodded, relief clear on his weathered face. My Anna's wedding next month. You and Jake would be welcome. After he left, Jake pulled Clara close. You're building something here. Community. Trust. Things I couldn't have done alone. We're building it. Clara corrected. Together. The ride home was subdued. Men exhausted by violence and relief. But as they crested the ridge above the triple bar, Clara saw something that made her heart lift. Neighbors were already there, women with food, men ready to help repair damage. A community coming together not in crisis this time, but in celebration of survival. Look at that, Jake murmured. 6 months ago, they were ready to burn us out over water. Now we're neighbors. Clara finished. Real neighbors, the kind that show up when needed. As they rode down toward home, toward the people waiting to welcome them, Clara felt a settling in her chest. This was what she'd been fighting for. Not just survival, but belonging. Not just a house, but a home. Not just a husband, but a partner. The ghosts would always be there. Thomas in her memories. Margaret and Sarah in Jake's. But they were peaceful ghosts now. Part of the foundation on which new life was built. And as Jake helped her from her horse, his hands gentle despite the violence they'd just survived, Clara knew that whatever came next, they would face it as they had everything else, together, stubborn as prairie grass, enduring as the land itself. The winter was mild that year, as if nature itself was making amends for the brutal drought. Clara stood at the window of the Triple Bar ranch house, watching Jake work with a young colt in the corral. His movements were patient, gentle, so different from the hard man she'd first met in that dusty street a lifetime ago. Doc Henderson had saved him, though it had been close. The bullet wound from the raid had festered, infection setting in despite Clara's careful tending. For 3 days Jake had burned with fever, and Clara had made bargains with God, promised anything if he would spare this man who'd become her whole world. Now, 2 months later, Jake moved carefully but steadily, the wound leaving him with just a slight stiffness on cold mornings. They didn't speak of those terrible days when he'd hovered between life and death, but something had shifted between them. The last walls had fallen, leaving only truth and tenderness. You're wool gathering again, Maria said, bringing Clara a cup of tea. Just thinking. Clara accepted the cup gratefully. About how much has changed. Say, 1 year ago, you were alone, fighting to save chickens. Now look, mistress of the biggest ranch in the county, wife to a good man. Maria's eyes twinkled. Maybe soon, little ones running around? Clara's hand went unconsciously to her stomach. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even Jake, wanting to be sure. But the signs were there, the morning sickness, the tenderness, the peculiar certainty that grew stronger each day. Maybe, she said softly. A rider approaching the gate caught her attention. Ben Baxter, she realized with surprise. Since the raid against the rustlers, he'd been cordial but distant, their relationship still marked by the wounds of the drought. But here he was, hat in hand. Jake met him in the yard, and Clara watched their conversation with growing concern. Baxter's gestures were agitated, Jake's posture increasingly tense. When they finished, Jake came inside, his face grim. What is it? Clara asked. Railroads coming through, Chicago and Western Line. They're offering to buy out ranches along the proposed route. He paused. Or they'll use eminent domain if folks don't sell willing. Clara's heart sank. They'd survived drought and rustlers. only to face an enemy that couldn't be fought with guns or courage. Our land. Not directly, but they want water rights along Willow Creek, want to dam it upstream for their water towers. Jake's jaw tightened. That would destroy us as sure as any drought. The fight that followed was different from any they'd faced. Not violence, but lawyers. Not bullets, but papers filed in distant courts. The railroad had money, influence, the weight of progress behind them. What did ranchers have against that? We have each other, Clara said at the next town meeting. She stood before neighbors who'd once shunned her, who'd burned her out, who'd also stood beside her against raiders. We've proven that together we're stronger than any threat. Pretty words, Baxter said, but not unkindly. But the railroad's got senators in their pocket. What do we have? The truth, Doc Henderson said, and newspapers willing to print it. My nephew works for the Kansas City Star. He's been investigating railroad land grabs. It was Clara who suggested they invite the journalist to visit, to see for himself what the railroad would destroy. Jake was skeptical. What did distant city readers care about prairie struggles? But Clara remembered something Margaret Thornton had told her. Words Jake had shared during his recovery. Stories move hearts more than facts move minds. Young William Henderson arrived on the stage, a thin man with keen eyes and ink-stained fingers. Clara and Jake showed him the land, introduced him to families who'd lived here for generations, but it was the story of the drought that caught his imagination. You shared water? He scribbled in his notebook. Enemies working together? Neighbors, Clara corrected. We remembered we were neighbors. The articles began appearing 2 weeks later. Not just facts about water rights and legal maneuvers, but stories. The widow who'd lost everything refusing charity. The wealthy rancher humbling himself to save others. Enemies becoming allies as drought threatened all. The railroad executives, comfortable in their Chicago offices, hadn't expected the public response. Letters poured in, defending the ranchers, demanding fair treatment. It's not enough, Jake said one evening, reading the latest legal filing. They're still coming. Clara took the papers from him, set them aside. Then we make it enough. She took his hands, placed them on her still flat stomach. We make it enough for the next generation. Jake's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Clara, you're 3 months along. Doc Henderson confirms. She watched joy war with worry in his eyes. I know the timing seems impossible. The timing is perfect. He pulled her into his arms, careful as if she were spun glass. A child. Our child. Then the worry won. But the fight with the railroad, the stress, will be worth it. Jake, this child deserves to inherit the land we've fought for, the community we've built. She pulled back to meet his eyes. I won't let the railroad take that future. The revelation gave Jake new purpose. He threw himself into the legal battle with renewed energy, but also began preparing for possibilities. If they lost, they'd need resources to start over. If they won, they'd need to rebuild what the fight had cost. Then came an unexpected ally, Margaret Thornton's father, a banker in St. Louis whom Jake had been estranged from since her death, arrived unannounced. Clara watched nervously as the two men faced each other, Jake stiff with old pain. Mr. Carlyle Gray with years and grief. I heard about your troubles, Carlyle said simply. Margaret would want me to help. We don't need, yes, you do. The older man's voice was firm. I have connections in Chicago, railroad board members who owe me favors. But I want something in return. Jake's face hardened. What? Tell me about her last days. Tell me about my granddaughter. I couldn't bear to hear before, but now. His voice broke. I'm old, Jake. I need to know before it's too late. That evening, as spring rain fell soft outside, Jake spoke of Margaret and Sarah. Clara held his hand as he painted pictures with words. Sarah's laugh, Margaret's grace, their last Christmas together. Mr. Carlyle wept openly. Years of bottled grief finally released. She was happy, he said finally. Despite everything, the isolation, the hardships, she was happy here. She made it home. Jake said simply, Carlyle stayed a week. By the time he left, things had shifted in their favor. Board members began questioning the water rights grab. The newspaper stories had made the ranchers sympathetic figures. And elections were coming. Politicians who'd backed the railroad began reconsidering. The final hearing was in Topeka. Clara, now showing her pregnancy, insisted on attending despite Jake's protests. "This is our child's future being decided," she said. "I'll be there." The courtroom was packed. Ranchers, townspeople, even some who'd come from other counties facing similar threats. When Clara was called to testify, she spoke not of legal precedents but of people, of Ben Baxter saving his ranch to give his daughter a wedding, of Doc Henderson, who delivered most of the county's children, needing clean water for his medicines, of the community that had survived drought and violence by remembering they were neighbors. "The railroad promises progress," she concluded. "But progress that destroys communities isn't progress at all. It's just greed dressed in prettier clothes." The judge's decision took a month. When it came, Jake read it aloud in the packed church. The railroad could build, but existing water rights must be respected. No dams on Willow Creek. Compensation required for any land taken. It wasn't total victory, but it was enough. That night, the town celebrated. The same church where they'd fought over water during the drought now rang with laughter and music. Clara, tired but happy, watched Jake dance with Anna Baxter at her wedding reception, held a month late but no less joyful for the delay. "Never thought I'd see this," Ben Baxter said, standing beside her. "Jake Thornton dancing at my daughter's wedding. Year ago, I'd have shot him for stepping on my land." "Things change," Clara said. "You changed them. You and that stubborn refusal to let us stay enemies." He paused. "I'm glad you'll be raising children here. They'll grow up better for it." As if in response, the baby kicked. The first movement Clara had felt, she gasped, hand going to her stomach. And suddenly, Jake was there, concern in his eyes. "I'm fine," she laughed. The baby moved. "Here, feel." He placed his hand where hers had been, waited. Then his eyes widened as he felt the flutter of life. Around them, the celebration continued, but for that moment they were alone in their wonder. Later, as they prepared for bed in their room at the hotel, Jake pulled Clara close. "I've been thinking about names," he said. "If it's a girl, Margaret Sarah." Clara finished. "I know. And if it's a boy, Thomas James." Jake's voice was soft. "If that's all right with you." "It's perfect." Clara turned in his arms. "We're really doing this, building a family, a future." "Scared?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "But the good kind of terrified, the kind that means you're alive and fighting for something worth having. That's my Clara," he murmured, turning even fear into courage. They returned to the Triple Bar the next morning, to the ranch that had become truly theirs through trial and triumph. The prairie stretched endless under the spring sky, grass green with promise. As they crested the ridge above the ranch, Clara could see the buildings spread below, house and barns, corrals and gardens, all the infrastructure of a working ranch but also a home. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked. "About that first day you came to fix my chicken coop. How angry I was, how certain I didn't need anyone." She smiled. "I was such a fool." "No, you were surviving the only way you knew how. It took courage to let those walls down. You taught me that when you let yours down for me." They sat there on horseback, looking down at their domain. In a few months, there would be a child in the nursery Maria was already preparing. The community they'd helped forge would continue to grow. There would be other challenges, there always were on the frontier, but they would face them as they had everything else, together. "I love you, Clara Thornton," Jake said suddenly. "I don't say it enough, but you say it every day." Clara interrupted. "In how you touch me, how you look at me, how you've made space in your life for me to be myself. Words are nice, but actions matter more." "Then let me act." He dismounted, helped her down carefully, mindful of her condition. Mrs. Thornton, would you do me the honor of walking our land with me? Of planning where we'll build the new barn, where we'll plant the garden, where our children will play." "Our children?" Clara raised an eyebrow. "Already planning more than one?" "A dozen, at least," Jake said, making her laugh. "This land is too big for just one child to inherit." They walked hand in hand through the grass, boot prints side by side in the soft earth. Behind them, the past lingered, graves on distant hills, memories of loss and pain. But ahead stretched the future, bright with possibility as the prairie sun. The touch that had once sparked fear. "You're hurting me," she'd said, had become something else entirely. It was comfort in the night when old grief surfaced. It was strength when facing enemies legal and physical. It was the gentle caress on her growing belly, promising protection and love to the life within. It was the fire that burned between them, transforming two broken souls into something whole. As the sun climbed toward noon, they headed home, to the house that had sheltered them through storms, to the people who'd become family, to the life they'd built from ashes and determination. Clara felt the baby move again, stronger this time, as if eager to join this world its parents had fought so hard to preserve. "Thank you," Jake said suddenly. "For what?" "For being too stubborn to let me send you away, for seeing past my walls, for making me live again instead of just survive." Clara squeezed his hand. "Thank you for staying, that day in the storm. You could have ridden on, but you stayed. Best decision I ever made," he said simply. And it was, for both of them. As they walked through the gate of the triple bar, Maria waving from the porch and Samuel calling a greeting from the corral, Clara knew that every struggle had led to this moment. Every loss had taught them to value what they'd gained. Every battle had forged bonds that would last a lifetime. The prairie had tested them with drought and fire, violence and greed. But they'd proven themselves worthy of this land, this life, this love. And as Clara felt Jake's hand warm and steady in hers, she knew that whatever came next, they would meet it with the strength of two hearts forged into one. Burning bright as the endless western sky, the rancher's touch had indeed turned to fire, not the destructive flame of loss and anger, but the warming blaze of home and heart. And in that fire, they would forge a future worthy of all they'd sacrificed to build it. Thank you for listening to our Wild West love story. If you enjoyed this tale of Clara and Jake's journey from loss to love, from isolation to community, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just as neighbors did on the frontier. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on this story of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of love. Until next time, may your own trails lead to happiness and home.